Good evening. You're listening to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight is Professor Pixel. We are covering some horror movies here as it's the season for it. What better way to start talking about horror movies and talk about Hammer horror films? In particular, we're going to go with the 1959 release of The Mummy starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Professor Pixel, this is one of those movies as a kid. When I saw it, I went, wait a minute, the black and white Mummy was okay, but wow, this one's actually scary. And it's in color. But like we recently talked about on one of our earlier videos with Dracula that started the whole thing off, this Mummy movie is damn good watching. It's sexy, it's beautiful, it's alluring, it's very atmospheric, great set pieces. A lot more exposition in this film, if you were, between people talking that actually dive deep into what's going on with the history of it, which we did not really get that with Dracula from 1958. So I kind of like that little bit of a touch too. But for me, there's not obviously as many mummy movies out there as vampires do the popularity. But that being said, I still think this is a great horror film. I think it's a great mummy film. It's a Hammer horror film. You almost can't go wrong with it too. I loved watching it. You as the millennial man, give me your take on this. I know you're pretty new to all of these, so I'm curious to see how well you may have liked it or didn't like it.
Well, I didn't know exactly what to expect. The only Mummy I had seen before was the one with Brendan Fraser. I believe that's 1999. And
I'm sorry.
wow,
It's a cute movie.
yeah, no, it's definitely not a horror movie. But this absolutely is. And there's many elements to it, and the story is told in a span of time. Like when we talked about Dracula before, it takes place and it all feels very quick. This, you have to keep in mind that you start off in like 1895, you jump 3 years later, and then there's a flashback sequence to explain the mummy himself, Karis. And it is a lot, but I was very interested in watching it. And the key thing that I'm going to talk about is really Peter Cushing's performance in this movie as John Banning, because I'm used to seeing him as either cold or rather confident. Because, like we said before, he was Van Helsing. He knows what he's doing. He knows everything that's going on, and he's pushing through. In this, it's rather the opposite. He has a lovely lady himself, and he's rather kind of, I know that's contradictory to what I just said, but he's kind of like a young bachelor. That's really what I take from it, and it's really jarring to see him in such a different way.
Yeah, I think here when we talk about the mummy, the first thing we think of is, oh, walking real slow, dragging a foot. And a lot of people growing up from my generation, the 80s generation, saw all the Universal horror films. And there was an uptick in the 80s of not just horror films in general, thanks to, I would say, Halloween from John Carpenter and some successful ones that launched a bunch of B and C and D and E level films in the 80s, slashers mostly. But there was also a preponderance of, hey, let's look at movies from the 40s and 50s and sometimes even younger. So Humphrey Bogart was still popular in the 80s, and you could see the occasional film, as well as some of these older films would come, like House of Wax with Vincent Price, those types too. The really colorful, glossy ones that the small theaters could get a handle of. That's one of the things about this film that, again, I think is great, just like Dracula, where it's just extremely vibrant. And the use of colors is a little different. I'm going to go into that in a minute. But overall, I think being able to check something out like this and see that it still has some staying power is a testament to how well, business-wise, Hammer Horror Films was able to do things.
Yeah.
But for me, just one more thing I was going to say is that when you talk about Peter Cushing, what I liked about him, and I want to play off of what you said, is in Dracula, he's the competent guy. He knows what he's doing. He's not screwing around. But in this film, he's more of an academic. And that doesn't mean he's a wuss ass or anything like it. But when it starts off, he's got a broken leg. So his crew's trying to get into the tomb. So does he really actually enter the tomb and desecrate it, even though they get warned about it or not? I think this whole setup here, there's a lot of it going on. I'm like, holy crap, we're not easing our way into this at all. They're going 100 miles an hour, just setting it up. And to your point, it does feel like it takes place over time, which it does. But to me, this isn't, I don't really almost want to call this a horror film because it seems like it's more of a drama to me. It's almost like a revenge sort of film. The violence is more like in Dracula, I would say, suggested. So it's not like, you're getting blood, guts everywhere. But to me, the thing that's the most horrific element isn't there's a curse or how serious the protectors are taking of it or the backstory with Karis. It's just the way Christopher Lee looks because, again, this is a low-budget film, made a crap ton of money. It's one of the template type movies that Hammer is known for quite some time, for decades now, starting in the 50s primarily, even though they had history before and after. I still look at him and go, he's still a damn good looking mummy, pun intended. What do you think about all that?
I'm actually going to disagree with you a little bit. I do love Christopher Lee. But I think the way he looks, because of how tightly bound the makeup is and how it exposes, he has the wrong facial structure to me. And whenever you see the poster, which inspired even the actors, there's a scene in which Peter Cushing stabs the mummy with a spear, and he was inspired by the poster itself. The little fact there, but it's his look is like you say, it is a little disturbing, but it's really because how exposing it is to his facial features. I really think.
So you don't like the way he looks, just basically because of the face?
Yeah. I mean, when he is in other roles, when he was in Dracula, like I said, it doesn't feel as noticeable. But whenever it's tightly bound to him, and you can see every facial feature and how long his face really is, it's a little off-putting for the mummy itself, I think.
Okay, we'll just disagree. I think he looked great in there, and I understand what you're saying. And of course, being a period piece, obviously we're not seeing a mummy walk around downtown Central Florida, let's say, and all that.
We're not.
Well, it works for what we're doing because mummies, and just like everything else that was taken seriously, is getting watered down so much where we just make fun of it. But there's two scenes in here I want to talk about before we talk about the ending, because one of them is the way he looks, and one is the way his set looks. So early on, we were talking about how Peter Cushing's kind of like playing against what we know him to be in this film, and unable to actually get inside the tomb once they get in there, even though the guy comes around and he warns them all about what's going on. What I liked is when they actually get inside the tomb, and against practical effects, it's just a set piece. They're on a lot with a big light over there, but it still looks pretty damn good. It's like when you have a really great set piece on a real nice play or something. You do feel like it's there. It does create the spirit of it. What I noticed here is in Dracula, they use, of course, a lot of like really solid, vibrant colors, particularly red, bright red too, which is how real blood is, not the dark red, which would be oxygenated. And here they using like green lights, and I go, God, this just looks like a pretty good Halloween Horror Nights type thing that you'd see at a fun house somewhere. But I'm going, it still works. It's just how serious the actors take their material that they're dealing with here and talking with each other. Again, like in Dracula, they do it here. To me, once they started getting into all that and you see all the ancient stuff, it just makes you go, okay, and it works. And then the other scene that I just wanted to point out that to me, I actually thought for some reason as a kid, it terrified the crap out of me, is I call it the Bog Scene. It's where the mummy's being transported by these two guys who had been hired and they're kind of out of control on their horse and buggy, and the casket falls off of the horse and buggy into the bog and sinks in there. But then eventually, we know from that bog that the mummy rises from there before he goes and starts, doing his revenge. And for as a kid, I just remember that terrified the crap out of me because of how thick the bog looked. And even though you look at it and then you go, yeah, that's just a set piece with some lights on it, it still looks good. And just like Dracula, the music really adds a lot to it as well. But those are two scenes that stuck out to me. And before we talk about the final, as it were, I know there's a couple scenes you kind of wanted to talk about. So let's talk about those.
Well, I have a little fact that I want to talk about, and that's when at the beginning, because we meet Peter Cushing, and he has a broken leg. The first thing he does is swat a fly. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, because the fly swatter.
He swatted a fly?
He did, with a fly swatter, and the fly swatter wouldn't exist until 1905. This is 10 years in advance. And while there are kinds of devices used to hit insects, none quite as the one that he uses there. Just a little thing I noticed. But really what I love is kind of it's not betrayal. The guy warns them, Mehmet Bey.
Mm-hmm.
He warns them not to go in there, because if they go in there, they are setting themselves up for what happens. And then it turns out that Mehmet Bey is really the man behind it.
Yeah.
Everything that we've seen thus far, he's the one doing this. And I get that he is the worshiper of Karnak, and so I guess he felt like he had to. But I thought it was a genuine warning at the beginning, and then to learn that, oh, he's the one responsible, it's a twist a little bit, even though we see it halfway through the movie.
Do you think that, I'm still kind of shaking, you being the millennial 20-something, I like to say on here. You point out the whole fly swatter thing. I just ignored it. It didn't stand out to me that much. But did you think that this scene that you're talking about, or this, let me back up and say it this way. I think there was a lot of stuff going on in this film that maybe a normal horror film wouldn't have. For example, not only do you get the history of it, not only do you get the backstory of the character, which you really didn't get with Dracula, because they literally flesh him out a little bit, especially with the, looking back with some scenes. But in here, I almost took it as an adult fairy tale, in that it's basically, don't do the wrong thing or you'll suffer the consequences of your actions, right, wrong, or whatever. Because, whether you call it a betrayal or not, or what too, with him being behind everything, I just went, well, they're doing something. They wanted the stuff. They got the stuff. Now they just have to pay the price for it. So I had no problems with it, because, again, it's just a pretty simple, basic, supposed to be horror film. But I don't know. To me, that kind of stood out a little bit more. And I don't know that I was really expecting that in here, too. So you sounded a little surprised about the fact that they would do like a flashback and fleshing out the character, too. It's kind of like what they did in your Mummy movie from 1999 with Brandon Fraser.
Yeah.
How did you feel about that? Did that work for you?
Oh yeah, it absolutely worked, and I think it's better than them just telling us. Because in Dracula, like we talked about before, I hate to just compare it to that, but at the same time, that's the main thing you can compare it to. In Dracula, they tell you a lot about how to handle Dracula and everything behind what you have to do with him, but they don't make him a character. The Mummy is a character. He has a full story. He has a devotion himself, which goes against his own religion. So as he's being controlled by Mehmet Bey, if you're okay with us getting to the ending here a little bit.
Yeah.
Whenever it comes to Peter Cushing's love interest, fiance, or his wife, I'm not sure. She looks like Princess Ananka, who the mummy, Karis, was in love with. And so he gets forced at the end to make a decision. Mehmet Bey is telling him, you have to kill them. And that's when Karis really breaks free of Mehmet Bey's control and kills him instead and takes Isabel, who he thinks is his princess, to the swamp once more.
Did you like the ending?
I felt it was a little abrupt. So, because as he's going to the swamp, eventually Peter Cushing catches up and yells to Isabel as she regains consciousness because she passed out whenever the mummy came towards her. He tells her to tell him to put him down. The mummy obeys, and whenever Isabel is told to get down, she does, and they just shoot down the mummy. And I believe he has the scroll of life with him. So, but it's, I don't know. Honestly, I'm mixed.
Conflicted.
I am conflicted because I don't mind it. I mean, it tells the full romance of this character, and then him just getting shot down though, and that sticking, it doesn't feel right for something that doesn't have, well, vital organs.
Yeah, it's the way I would describe it is like Dracula, came out a year earlier, just hits you right in the face. Obviously, I love the film. This film, excuse me, I like it. I don't love it. It's decent for what it is. When I think of a mummy movie, what am I going to watch? Well, there's the Universal horror one of the Mummy. There's this one. There's a couple other mummy movies out there. Not many. Obviously, a lot of people go, "Oh yeah, Brendan Fraser, The Mummy." Well, that's an action movie. That's not a horror film. And while I actually think that movie's mildly entertaining, even though the CGI wasn't that great, it was done okay for what it was at the time. It was effective, but it's basically Indiana Jones for kids with a mummy in it. It's not really about the mummy to me. I don't. It's not spooky. It's not scary. It's not meant to be that way at all. And unfortunately, there's no, I think, serious appreciation for old things like this. And like I said before, Dracula, in that movie that came out, he didn't turn into a bat. He didn't turn into fog or rats or any of that other crap. It was basically, no, he is what he is. It's like this. And they made it more adult-like that we can relate to if we're older and watching it without having all this phantasmical stuff going on. And here in The Mummy, I think you're right. It's a bit of an abrupt ending. I think it works for what the story they tell you about it. I'm not really scared by the mummy. He's just kind of creepy looking. So that's another thing too. It's not like you just constantly are thinking about him. He's going to move really slow and kill somebody that's in a confined space, and that's it. And he just has a master that's basically using him as a hitman. So it does feel a little flat to me in that way, but it's still, I think for me, in closing, I'd still say it's worth a watch. And unfortunately, I wish there would still be a really, really good mummy movie. And on that note, Tom Cruise's mummy movie, while very sexy looking, was a failure because it tried to do too many things. It tried to be like an adventure. It tried to be a comic film. There are some scenes that were a little almost horrific and creepy. I'm not saying Christopher McQuarrie, whoever wrote it, did a bad job with it, but it felt like they were trying to appeal to too many different points of view, and I think that's where it failed. It's a Tom Cruise movie with a mummy in it. This movie is just a very basic mummy movie, and that's it.
You look upon the Tom Cruise mummy movie with more admiration than I do.
It's a failed attempt, and it disappoints me because that was one of the first movies. There's some before that, Dracula Untold, which I actually thought was decent. That was Universal's way of trying to reboot their old franchise, because here we are in the 50s and 60s with Hammer horror film, or Hammer films in general, not necessarily Hammer horror, but Hammer films, basically saying, you know what, we're going to do what Universal already did, but we're going to do it our way. We're going to sex up a little bit. We're going to make it a little bit more serious, treat it like a little bit more adult in nature. We're going to give it the gothic British treatment to it, and we're going to do it on the cheap, but we're going to get really good writers and actors and directors and set pieces, and we're going to make a a boatload of money, and they did, and it was a really successful template. And to this day, I tell you that a lot of great movies are made on small budgets, because why? They have that small little group of people that influence the movie, and it basically has that one vision. So that's where I, again, am a big fan of what Hammer has done with a lot of the films, as opposed to what The Mummy tried doing, or even Dracula Untold. Unfortunately, because Tom Cruise and The Mummy tanked so bad, there wasn't going to be a Wolfman movie or this or that or whatever. And I was deeply disappointed, because that kind of horror, classic horror, it's gone. We don't have that anymore. And so it makes me a little bit sad saying it. So I won't say that I look at the Tom Cruise one with admiration. I just look at it and go, it's a missed opportunity. Because if that did
Yeah,
well
I agree.
and was a bit more note, we'd have a bunch more of these old classic type horror films done. Oh my goodness.
Revitalized. Yeah, you're absolutely right. A monster cinematic universe, as it were. And I was interested in seeing where that went, especially as Russell Crowe as Jekyll and Hyde.
I thought he was tremendous. Would you
Oh,
not
yeah.
go see a movie with Russell Crowe as him as the character in it? I would.
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt. But to finish up on the point, I do see how this movie inspired the Brendan Fraser one, which I know we say it's not a horror film in the slightest, but keeping that classic romance, as it were, accompanying the horrific aspect of, wow, this is coming back to life, and it wants to be itself again. I think that this, in a lot of ways, is really special, and I'm glad we covered it.
Did you like this one more or less than Dracula? Or can you compare 'em?
I don't think we can compare them. I mean, I know we have for how they're done. They're done by the same company. They have the same actors in the leading roles. But when you have these different kinds of stories, it's really hard to like, oh, well, this is better than that. They're completely different, because one is a monster movie. This is a misunderstood love story.
Yeah. Well, the Brendan Fraser Mummy at least kind of played that up a little bit, somewhat smartly and decently, I thought, too. So, yeah, and that's why I said it's not really almost a horror movie to me. It's more like a drama or a thriller or
Yeah.
something. It's not like Dracula. So I would agree with you on that. But it's labeled as horror as such, and we'll treat it that way. Yeah, decent film. Definitely worth watching again if you want to check something out that's a little different than what you're normally used to. If you're a British horror film like I am, you've already probably seen it. It's worth a rewatch. Hadn't seen it in years, but we watched it tonight to cover it here on the Xtreme Movie Show. So for Professor Pixel, I'm your host, Rob. I want to say thanks to everybody listening for it. Let us know of any horror movies or just movies in general that you'd like us to take a look at and give the extreme treatment to. Be happy to take a look at that. We definitely have a few more horror films coming up here in October. I'd like to thank Pixel for coming in and joining me, giving me his Millennial Man review on it. I'd like to thank everybody who's participating here on the Xtreme Movie Show. Have a good night. As always, stay extreme.